Okay, hi you beautiful New Zealanders. This is the third video that we have done about how New Zealand is inching towards tribal rule. And the truth is that New Zealand is slowly creeping towards Maori being in total control of the country. Every area of our society has been affected. So just watch this. So New Zealand is now a two-tier nation. The video you're about to watch is one of a series putting forward the idea that Maori are taking control of New Zealand. Video 1 examined the shocking extent of Maori privilege that now exists in our country. Video 2 asks and answers the question, how did this happen? In video 2 we took a deep dive into the 1974 Maori Affairs Amendment Act. We showed how this act opened the door to the rise of apartheid, racism, separatism, and the birth of a two-tier nation. So, to find out how New Zealand has become a two-tier nation, we draw on 5 sources. And the first source is New Zealand legislation, that's important laws and court cases that have gone through our statutes. These important laws and court cases have enabled the explosive expansion of Maori privilege. In this video, video 3 in the series, we look at the Treaty of Waitangi Act 1975. To understand how corrupt the Treaty of Waitangi Act was and is, we first need to understand how activists were feeling about the treaty in 1975. For them, the treaty was clear. The preamble said that the British set up government for all the inhabitants of New Zealand, both Maori and non-Maori. Article 1, Maori ceded sovereignty completely and forever to the British in 1840. This meant they gave up the government of the entire country to the British. Article 2, the British promised to protect Maori in the ownership of their land, dwellings and property. Article 2, Part 2, the British would have exclusive rights to buying Maori land. Article 3, in return for ceding sovereignty, Maori would be granted all the rights and privileges of British citizenship. And finally, the affirmation, the chiefs declared that they understood what they were signing up to. That was it. The treaty was so clear, yet ironically, it was this clarity which really riled the activists. They did not like it at all. In a nutshell, activists regretted ceding sovereignty and selling 92% of their land. So what did they do? They set about looking for ways to reverse the decisions the 540 chiefs had made in 1840 and the decisions their ancestors had made to sell their land. That was it. That's what this is all about. Maori complaints and dissatisfaction with the plain meaning of the treaty was not new. Even the great Siraparananata in the 1920s and 30s had been niggled by activists. Look at what he said. He said the treaty made one law for the Maori and Pākehā. If you think things are wrong and bad, then blame our ancestors who gave away their rights in the days when they were very powerful. Now, obviously, Maori were coming to him saying things were bad and wrong with the treaty. See? So he had the same problem way back in the 1920s and 30s. And there's the reference. Siraparananata even defended land confiscations. Notice what he said. Some have said these confiscations were wrong and that they contravened the articles of the treaty. See, there again, he was fielding complaints from Maori in the 1920s and 30s about confiscations, just like we are today. So what's his answer? He said the government placed in the hands of the Queen of England the sovereignty and the authority to make laws. Some sections of the Maori people violated that authority. War arose from this and blood was spilled. The law came into operation and land was taken in payment. It was their own chiefs who ceded that right to the Queen. The confiscations cannot therefore be objected to in light of the treaty, and there's the reference. So look at that. New Zealand's greatest Maori said to Maori activists back in the 1920s and 30s, stop complaining about land confiscations because they were completely justified under the terms of the treaty. Well, we don't hear that today, do we? So, if you were an activist wanting to take New Zealand back, and the government of New Zealand back, what would you do? You'd plot, you'd plan, you'd scheme, you'd connive. You use all your powers of persuasion, you'd look for opportunities, you'd strategize, you'd exploit the weaknesses of leaders in Parliament, especially their history ignorance. Above all, you'd find ways to change the meaning of the treaty. Wouldn't you do this? And so this is what they did in 1975. The Treaty of Waitangi Act was a major step forward for activists. The architect of this act was Labour Cabinet Minister Matthew Rata. There he is. The bill was set up in such a way as to invite corruption and fraud. The way it was framed, oh my goodness, it was so open to corruption and fraud. Well, how so? Let's look at this. The Act says of itself, quote, An act to provide for the observance and confirmation of the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi by establishing a tribunal to make recommendations on claims relating to the practical application of the treaty and to determine whether certain matters are inconsistent with the principles of the treaty. Notice twice in that paragraph it mentions the principles of the treaty. The problem with this definition is the Act did not define the principle. This was done deliberately. Why? Activists had not been able to make the treaty say what they wanted it to say, so inventing principles allowed activists in the tribunal, which was birthed out of the Act, and activist judges to manipulate the meaning of the treaty. You see, if you don't define the principles, you can make the treaty say whatever you want, which is exactly what they wanted to do. Literally any claim that was submitted to the tribunal could be accepted on the basis of a made-up principle. In other words, the principles could be made up on the fly to suit whatever case was laid before it. Not defining the principles was a ploy, it was a scam. This is what David Seymour's on about. But there was a second way in which the Treaty of Waitangi Act invited fraud and corruption. What was that? Well, the Act chose the wrong English version of the treaty, known as the rogue James Freeman version. This version varied enormously from the treaty in Maori. From this, activists were able to say, quote, "The English and Maori versions are so different that you'll need a Maori to do an accurate back translation for you to tell you what the treaty really means." Can you believe that? Well, it's not hard to see how this situation led to fraud and corruption. Imagine that. That's actually what happened. But the fraud and corruption did not stop there. There's a third way in which this act invited fraud and corruption. Anecdotes, stories, and memories of claimants were to be accepted as facts by the tribunal. Now, I'm not making this up. This is what the act actually said. A claimant could say that such and such a piece of land was sacred to them and they wanted it returned, and the tribunal would set to work organising the return. The tribunal became a glorious path for getting something for nothing. You could just simply rock up with a story, a memory, an anecdote, and they would take it as true, and you would get your claim approved. Can you believe that? It was a never-ending lotto win for claimants. Treaty commentator Mike Butler writes this. He says, "The Waitangi Tribunal is free to receive whatever evidence it pleases. Anecdote, reminiscence, hearsay are acceptable." There was a situation, he says, that prompted Waitangi Tribunal Chairman Eddie Dury to say that some claimants had asked researchers to alter findings that were unhelpful in their cases, and there's the reference. You see the fraud? Historian Bruce Moon writes this. He says, "The Waitangi Tribunal accepts verbal accounts of elderly men up to 180 years later without cross-examination." That's 180 years after the treaty was signed. Again, in 1922, Sir Nata, the greatest Maori scholar of his age, wrote, "The chiefs placed in the hands of the Queen of England the sovereign authority to make laws." Unquote. Treaty twisters, he says, today do not hesitate to belittle him. In 2014, 5 members of the Waitangi Tribunal, Craig Coxhead, Professor Richard Hill, Kihi Ngātai, Ranganui Walker and Joanne Morris, stated, "The rangatira who signed Te Tiriti did not cede their sovereignty. This was either culpable ignorance or deliberately lying," says Bruce Moon. And there's the reference. There was a fourth reason why the Waitangi Tribunal was set up to encourage fraud and corruption. You see, only the tribunal members could interpret the meaning of the treaty. In other words, they would and could literally make up the meaning of words in the treaty, and these meanings were to be accepted as fact and truth. No cross-examination, no challenge to those meanings was acceptable. Here's the kicker. The Waitangi Tribunal, which was birthed as a result of the Treaty of Waitangi Act in 1975, was only an advisory body. In other words, it was set up to advise the government about what to do with settlements and cases that were laid before it. Now, what you probably don't know is the tribunal has 60 full-time staff at a cost of an average of $21 million per annum to the taxpayer. We're paying for this. So the tribunal had time to produce lengthy reports full of Maori words and extremely detailed. I mean, you get 60 people working on some cases, and they can come up with some pretty doozy documents. When these documents were laid before politicians to make a decision, what happened? Politicians are and were, generally speaking, history ignorant. They don't come into Parliament being guns on New Zealand history or the treaty. They do not. And Luxon is a classic example. See, no one can discern lies from truth if they don't know the truth. Think about that. Politicians had no way of discerning whether the tribunal's recommendations were based on truth or not, even with the help of their officials. So they were driving blind, just as that picture says. Plus, the reports were usually deliberately marinating in Maori words, which made them even more difficult to understand. Politicians were also very busy people. So politicians simply put the reports from the tribunal into the, quote, all too much basket and stamped them approved. Some of these reports are 2,000 pages. It would be fair to say that the government, in setting up the Waitangi Tribunal via the Treaty of Waitangi Act 1975, has been paying activists, that is, i.e. the tribunal members, $21 million a year on average to use fraud and corruption to gift cash and assets to Maori. That's our cash and assets, stuff belonging to all New Zealanders. This act was one of the major reasons why Maori privileges, that's what I detailed in video 1 of this series, have ballooned out of control. There you go. The result? Maori have done so well out of the tribunal, settlements and undefined treaty principles that activists thought they would try their luck with adding privileges to their shopping list. The activists reasoned, no one is stopping us. That is, there's no protest or marches from Pakeha, so let's just keep it all going. Let's add privileges to settlements. Let's keep inching towards total Maori control. And this is what happened. Maori activists have interpreted our silence as approval. When we don't march, when we don't protest, they say, oh, Pakeha must be okay about this. And so they keep rolling. As long as non-Maori don't oppose settlements and privileges, Maori will have a go at keeping both going. You see, they want more of both. Now here's the interesting thing. Dr. John Robinson, who's written this book called Who Really Broke the Treaty, and he would arguably be New Zealand's best researcher and historian, he says this in his new book: all treaty settlements are based on the Crown having broken the treaty. Is that not true? Yes, it is. Since that is not so, he's saying since the Crown did not break the treaty, all such settlements are a fraud. There is no justification for the continued existence of either settlements or the Waitangi Tribunal. That is a big call, and there's the reference. So I would ask you to do this. This is so interesting. Get that book, read it for yourself. You get it from Trost Publishing. Alright, that'll do for this video. I didn't want it to be so long, but that's what it is. Please like this video, share it, and make comments. It really helps, especially getting it out to your friends. It all helps. Thanks also to those who are chipping in financially. That's really a big help. This is massive. Okay, see you next time. Thanks for being part of what we're trying to do to save our country.